Good morning to the Poetry Channel. We welcome today Fiona Sampson. Delighted, Fiona, that you can join us. And we're going to talk about your new book of poetry, number 29 or 30, I'm not quite sure which, Come Down. I've been reading Come Down, through these last evenings and last several weeks. It's really a magnificent book, and it's a very interesting book stylistically as well for me. Can you talk about the landscape of the book, the stylistic, the sort of poetic devices you use in the book? Whatever, just introduce the book a little bit to listeners. Go ahead.
Thank you, Indran. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. And there's a book. That's what it looks like. And in a way, that's a great introduction, not only because we all like to choose the cover image for our books, but because this cover image is a Sidney Nolan painting. Sidney Nolan was the great Australian painter, famous for his images which look like a kind of black key head of Ned Kelly, the Australian outlaw. And he for several decades, for the last several decades of his life, came to live in England, in quite near me actually, in on the borders of Wales in Herefordshire. Really unusual that anyone famous comes to live here, although most of the metaphysical poets, the great ones, came from here. The John Donne, the Vaughan, Traherne, they all came from Herbert, they all came from around here, but they left and went to London, and apart from Traherne. And Nolan is really interesting to me because not only because I love his work, but because his work is about the nature of Australia, and because I recently managed to trace my family, and they are Australian. Well, on my father's side, they're Australian. So, I mean, I didn't get there in time to meet my dad, but in discovering him, I discovered all those stories of migration out of Europe in the 19th century, starvation, poverty, all the usual things that force people to move, and some convicts as well, from Ireland, from Scotland, from Germany, and they all fetched up in Australia one way or another. And I've never been to Australia, so Australia for me is an Australia of the mind. And it's a kind of hinterland, it's a red country, as the soil here is red. We happen to live in a red countryside here too. And this picture is actually a Gallipoli soldier. I'll move it nearer.
Thank you. Yeah.
So he's dead. He's died in Gallipoli in the First World War, which was a kind of great, tragic Australia sort of entering the 20th century and entering kind of the great game with the great powers, because it was a kind of futile landing where it was an absolute massacre of the Anzac forces, which they still commemorate. It's their kind of big, tragic thing. But he looks to me like a green man. He looks to me like also like half a plant, very organic. And this is a book about roots and identity. So it's about the imagined Australia that I really, inverted commas, historically belong to, or my family does. And learning to put down roots here in the valley I moved to 5 years ago, where I don't have any family connections at all, but it's a place that's long settled. It's been settled since Roman times, in fact, since Neolithic times. So there are these various remains in the earth, not buried very deep. And we live in an old house, part of it's probably Saxon. And so that sense of, what is it to belong, but the kind of two alternative versions of what it is to belong, floating like a palimpsest on top of each other. I mean, I know obviously everybody with a properly hyphenated identity does this, but because I didn't grow up with my birth family, and so identity has always been very problematic for me, it's inevitably something I was going to explore at some point, and I've tended to not explore it or not explore it explicitly because of not wanting to rock the boat of the various families to which I ostensibly belong. But now I'm going to a stage in life where you can take those risks.
That's right. And you dedicate the book for the families, right? And then you say,
yes.
So this birth family is this Australian family, that you're investigating. And of course, Come Down. I mean, I remember growing up in England, and you scratch the soil, and you think somewhere down there is Australia, right? So
that's right, exactly.
You grew up with this idea.
Yes,
that you down under.
Yeah, down under, exactly, where they walk around on their heads, and yes, exactly.
Right. And mythical creatures come out of there, and you have golems in this book, and you have
I do, exactly. Although that's
manticores.
really, that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I'm very interested. I'm really interested in, I don't think the countryside is something over there that's static like a wallpaper. I think it's something that's been formed, certainly in Europe, it's been formed almost entirely now by human interaction, and it forms us when we live in it. I've lived in deep countryside now in various places for a quarter of a century, and it's my norm, and I know it impacts on me. It's not just a view outside the window. It affects the way I feel. It affects everything. There's a kind of microclimate, which is there's a micro psychogeography in a sense. There's a place where you begin to steer by, how the light is changing when it's going to rain, or all these things. You probably don't even know them consciously, but you know them physiologically, the way the birds do when they start calling their alarm calls because it's going to rain and that sort of thing. And I appreciate and I value that. So that really.
Now, why don't you read us a couple of the poems, sort of starting from A and going to Z, so to speak, or from the beginning of the book, if you like.
I will read you the first poem because it's about not belonging in a sense, and it's a different form of coming down, not the kind of coming down to land, which is in a sense the title Come Down, but a different kind of descent. Deaf. It's a metaphorical deafness, obviously. Deaf. Are you listening? You are listening to the world, you think, but you hear yourself over and over, the dark tongue of world, its hidden places under trees beyond the lights. Darkness falling from your feet so deep you could fall through it forever. And how loud world is with night in the trees, like a roost of galahs rising. The dark tongue of world rising up through you as you fall, dear self, dear lonely self, falling, silently mouthing through sound.
Yeah, I love that. I have an odd connection. I think of the beginning of the Satanic Verses, Salman Rushdie's novel of migration, when they're falling from the plane into, and then, that's just me.
That's a very flattering thing to say, but yes.
Yeah. And I'm wondering about, tell us about this, the poem is written in these short, please correct me if I'm misreading.
Yes, that's right.
Short lines,
quatrains,
and quatrains, and throughout the book, I have this sense, this vertical sense, I'm really reading down as opposed to across. Tell us about that, the stylistic choice of how you break up the lines and how you present the poem on the page, and its relationship to come down, literally.
That's a really lovely thing to say, that sense of vertigo. Thank you. In terms of the falling, I think we're all thrown into the world, aren't we? And we're thrown into whatever circumstance we're thrown into. I just believe that very strongly. None of the poems in the book have punctuation. They all are single sentence poems, including the really long poems that are several pages long. And my rules to myself were that this sentence had to make sense, and that I had to use evident phrasing or particularly line breaks to do the work of punctuation, to do the work of sense making, but that ultimately the words themselves, the choice of words, had to be so lucid, so unpretentious, so guided by a kind of assonantal impetus that I couldn't, that they would do the work themselves. So I didn't want it to be a puzzle, but I do think the words on the page are a musical score for an oral form, and that if you're reading a poem, anybody's poem, you need to treat it like that. You need to treat the line breaks like that. It's not that you necessarily pause, but you have a sense of their push and pull, their kind of elasticity, and that you've turned a corner, you've cornered in a sense when you when you get to the end of a line break. And I have regular numbers of stresses per line. So there is an inner muscularity, but the stresses aren't regular feats. They're not all iambs, for example. They're much more the way certainly my spoken English, well, and yours is, that's to say it's not all Latinate. It's not all I am. Sometimes it's a strong week, sometimes it's an anapest, conversational language is very, it feels very fluttering and untethered compared to like pentameter, iambic pentameter. But you can have a 5-stressed line, but just not have 5 iambics.
Right.
And it's freed to breathe a bit more.
Why don't we hear a couple of more poems so people can hear, what you're just saying, with the text. Go ahead. Whichever ones you'd like.
I read a couple that have slightly different line lengths from this, from each other. So here's Noumenon, which looks like this.
Right. Now, before you start Noumenon, just say, that's the sort of the essence, the thing as it is, right? Noumenon,
That's right. Well, there's sort of noumenon and phenomenon, aren't there?
Yeah.
And in Kant, they're the sort of, I always think of things as the plug and socket of consciousness. The phenomenon is what happens to you. I mean, we tend to say the numinous, and we mean the kind of spirit of things floating. Yeah. Well, cloudy is what we literally mean. But in Kant, and there is a phenomenon poem here too, so there is a noumenon, and a phenomenon, and they both start with the same line. First line, snow falls and fills the valley. And one is a daytime poem, one is a night poem, but also one is more about a perspective from the snow's perspective, and one is in a sense more the human perspective. Not exactly, but there's that kind of shift. And definitely one has got lots of light and one has got lots of shadow. So this is Noumenon. Snow falls and fills a valley, and under its white roof, a sleeper dreams snow is falling secretly for her alone. On and on in darkness, it falls like something speaking noiselessly into silence. Something that's all alone in silence, can't hear itself, can't feel grass or stones or the small branches it conceals. Even in the sleeper's dreams, falling snow cannot feel the world it longs to touch and misses, falling through its own cold embrace, on and on in the dark. The sleeper dreams snow is falling on her pillow as wide, wet words. The night speaks about itself. Snow speaking the words for night.
Wonderful. Dark in a way. I mean, and at the same time, you manage to get into and let the snow speak for itself. Go ahead. Why don't let's see a couple more.
That's a kind of fatter, longer line, and then I'm going to read you this one, which you've mentioned already, Frankenstein's Golem. We can talk a little bit about why. But here again, there's landscape, and here again, the landscape is a little bit. It's not picturesque. It's a little bit perhaps risky. Frankenstein's Golem. Actually, here I'm thinking of the Alpine landscape when Frankenstein's creature comes back towards him across the mer de glace, in the middle, in the heart of Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein's Golem. Who is this moving swiftly through darkness in a landscape not yet given form by daylight, slipping shapeless as a shadow through the dark and unknown places, wearing night next to his skin, wearing a pelt of pine and stone? Who is this, atoms seething on his skin, who passes through the dark where he was buried, and from which he was lifted not by love, by power alone, lifted from death and forced to pass through his own dying, who slips away between rocks as waterfalls electrify the dark? Who is this on the mountain where mornings break on the rocks orange, pink, terracotta, light new and tenderly wrought?
Great. Tell us about the Golem. What does the Golem do for Frankenstein? I mean, in this poem, yeah.
Well, in a way, of course, I'm actually saying in this poem that Frankenstein's creature is not a golem, because what I'm really talking about is I'm saying when he's buried and he's lifted up again through death, I'm talking about how in Mary Shelley's version, the creature, Frankenstein he doesn't exactly quite raid graveyards, but pretty much he takes parts of dead people and sews them together. He chooses the most beautiful parts, he thinks, and sews them together and brings them back to life. So I was thinking about the tragedy of the creature, which I think we tend to ignore in popular culture. It's all, you know, ho ho, the creature's Boris Karloff and doesn't look stupid. And actually, I think the tragedy of the nearly human, or the human who is othered, I think all of that is really, really potent. And I think was really close to Mary Shelley's intentions, because we have to remember that she was a radical, a revolutionary. The French Revolution had happened. Her mother had been involved in it. They thought the same thing was going to happen in England. And she had a strong sense of the sans culotte, the literally naked nature of the creature that Frankenstein experiments on and renders less than human, and of, you know, impoverished people, whether in France or in England or wherever in the world. And so I think that that's going on in Mary Shelley's version of Frankenstein. And so I wanted to talk about that agonizing experience it must be to kind of undie again, you just have to pass back through death again. You know, I mean, there's the Christian story of Lazarus, and that's kind of a raising from the dead, but that's, you know, that's a, you know, his sorrowing family want him brought back from the dead, and it's done through love. But this is both in James Whale's film and all the famous films that come since, and in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Frankenstein is just showing off. It's pure scientific hubris. He's just doing whatever he wants, and it's a human experiment in a sense. I mean, right, it's an humanity. Right. And so, you know, who was the notorious doctor of the 20th century who, you know, experimented on humans? Well, Dr. Mengele in the camps of the Holocaust. And, you know, I mean, he experimented on imprisoned people, and just obscenely, and tortured them. And so that's why it's a golem, because the golem is a Jewish thing, and it's not my tradition. So in a sense, I shouldn't borrow from it, but I think I'm doing respectfully. And a golem, of course, is a model figure, a clay figure who comes to life, who is, so therefore is not actually what Frankenstein has done to his creature, which is experiment on real people.
You know, throughout this book, you're going into the underworld. I mean, you're literally going to Australia, digging up your ancestors. You're bringing them back to life in this book. And so you have that going on. And then you have poems like Mother as Eurydice, and, you know, Eurydice. So I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but so tell us about, is there a one thesis that you would like a reader or to come away with, because I have a feeling that all the poems, well, you said that with the exception of the first one, fit. In other words, you know, that they speak to each other and they form part of a larger unified whole. So they, you know, they meet the Greek test or something of unity of place and time. But tell us about that. Or is it the search for unity, to reconnect with your own fractured self? Because you know, so go ahead, just if you could just reflect on that.
That's so interesting, Indran. Thank you. I think it's several things. I think one is, for me, the writing process tends to be, you know, a sense of returning to the same problem over and over for a period of time, for a period of, say, a couple of years. And then at some point that revisiting of that material is over. Now, that material might be purely technical material, or it might be conscious preoccupations, the theme of identity, or it might be sort of something that's not quite either, you know, that something tonal, that sense of, I mean, I'm quite synesthetic, so I tend to give everything colors. I mean, I don't give them, they arrive colored. And so I have a strong sense of the tonal note, the tonal atmosphere of a book. I mean, including when I'm reading, you know, being particular colors and being particular texture and so on.
Right.
So I think there's a unity that comes from that way of working that I kind of feel like I'm revisiting. I do think it's not that I don't believe in the individual lyric poem. I obviously do. Because that's the tradition I'm writing in. But I also believe in the coalescing of those individual freestanding poems, which kind of sparks of light, but they form a constellation. And again, that's something that I believe in as a reader too. So I will take a book which I've, you know, bought or been given or whatever, and I won't necessarily read it in order. I will read it, I'll open it, and then I'll open it somewhere else, and then I'll read it through in order to get a sense of the kind of the progression or the unity or whatever. But that sense that it has you step into the interior of a book and it has its own tonal world. That's just something that comes naturally to read as well.
Good.
But then I think it is a book that is very more consciously perhaps than my previous books, is a book about the search to belong. So it is more consciously thematic. And I think that's partly because I wrote it at a time when it has a lot of affinities with my previous book, poetry book, The Catch, which was an kind of explosion of joy and moved into this form of no punctuation, single sentence poems, and is very lucid and full of brightness and light because I just got married. We were living in France. It was very beautiful. It was wonderful. I'd been through some really bad times. So it's kind of a kind of spiritual joy, to be honest, really.
Right.
And this is the same voice, but it's more shaded and inflected, more engaged in a sense. Some of those poems in The Catch, which is a book I love because it's a moment of great happiness and joy in my life, are possibly a little too skate over the surface a little bit. There's a little bit more of the chthonic and come down. And one shouldn't, but I love Ted Hughes, for example. I love poems that engage with this sense of the haunted landscape, the mythical, I don't care whose myth, it's probably not mine, but I love that sense of, I love Mahmoud Darwish for the same reason. He's just it's a Jerusalem partly of the mind and partly the literal Jerusalem, really, all the time, the white city. But I just love that palimpsest experience that poetry can give you.
Right.
And there are two long poems in Come Down. One is about my adoptive father, and one is about my natural father. My adoptive father actually died in the pandemic, not at fact of COVID. He was a very old gentleman. He was 94. And my natural father, I never met. I've just got one photo of him when he's aged about 20. So, they're very different realities. But in both cases, I sort of put them into the landscape.
Right.
And the poem about my adoptive father is much more, it's not a ballad at all, but there's some repetition, there's a sense of the ballad form. Whereas the one about the father I didn't meet is much bigger scale and moves in and out of time zones, moves back through history, moves back to 19th century, and then the 19th century here in the valley. And, it moves, it's much more overtly layered.
There's so much to say about this book. And when you mentioned about landscapes, yes, I don't know, for some reason my mind went to Leonard Cohen, it's going darker. It's sort of his last album.
Yes, it's absolutely. You want it darker.
So you're going it a bit darker in this one than in your previous book.
Yes.
But that said, not too dark, no.
Yeah.
No, the happiness is still there, but it's more realistic or somehow.
Yes, you're exactly right.
And you're back in a sort of a foreboding landscape. Well, you're back at home, and yet you're not at home in this landscape where you are now. And
I'm back in a post-Brexit Britain, obviously pandemic Britain, an austerity Britain, a Britain that isn't. I've always had this slight resistance to Britishness, but obviously from the comfort of being born in London and so on. But whatever I do love about Britain has vanished, I hate Philip Larkin. I think that he was an incredible Little Englander and a misogynist and has been an incredibly bad influence on British poetry. But there's a sense, he has that line and going about that'll be about everything being tarmacked over, and that'll be England gone, the choirs, the lanes, about the shadows, and trees, and that palpable sense of its own particular history.
I understand, because I lived in England just as a child, 8 to 14, but I'm a big fan of Ray Davies and the Kinks songs and the albums, and then you have the sort of Marlborough Hillbillies and the Arthur, or the Decline and Fall of the British Empire, and these albums, so the sense of nostalgia.
That's great. That's great. But the kind of the pre-imperial, the kind of the very old, the ordinary people, the people who got cleared off the land in the agricultural revolution. Those are my you know, on the English side of my ancestry, those are my people, you know, the people who cleared off the land and went into the mines and the mills of the Industrial Revolution and lost that connection, which is all our birthright, you know. Clean air and clean water and food is all our birthright. And actually just to see a green field is all our birthright. And, you know, wherever we are in the world, I mean, maybe not a field, you know, but, you know, a bit of green. And and we forget too, I think.
We forget, yeah.
That only about 10 years ago did the tipping point happen globally, where globally more people are in cities than the countryside. Until then, they weren't. And there's this tremendous sense, I think, of the kind of culture makers, the urban culture makers, that, oh, the countryside is where you go when you're prosperous, and, you know, it's all very lovely, and, you know, you go there when you're moneyed and it's scenic. And of course, even by British standards, there's lots of rural poverty, just as there's urban poverty. And that's not the case at all. But globally, guys, think globally, you know, the relationship with having to grow your food so you can subsist. I mean, that's the global experience. And I think that we, you know, I think that certainly in Europe in general, I think that gets, and North America, so I think it gets terribly lost, you know.
Yeah. I inevitably to ask you, do we have time to read the two poems, the one for your adopted and then the natural father? I don't know. Would you like to try, or would you to rather pick one?
I'd like to try, but it's for you to say.
Okay.
Indran, if you.
Why don't we begin with the adopted the poem first?
I will tell you a couple of things about this, which is that my dad grew up in. My dad was an old dad, very old by the time I came along, obviously related to my adoption. And so he grew up before the war. He grew up in Kent, in Romney Marsh, which I don't know if you remember, it's a bottom right hand. It's a tip. It's opposite France. I mean, it's a bit where the channel is the narrowest. It's a bit that was connected to mainland Europe. And they talk about Romney Marsh as the lost continent. It's very special and beautiful still, and quite isolated. It's still a marsh. And my dad saw active service just at the very end of the Second World War, where he flew rescue missions to try and rescue crews who ditched in the North Sea and the Channel, just because that comes up at the end of the poem. Boat lane. Down a lane where bulrushes taller than me thrum, beetles with antler claws too heavy for them stumble at my feet. Once again, and for the first time, I'm following my father through a salt stink of fields the sea cannot forgive for belonging to it before marsh rose up, soft as shaking reeds in sunlight. And someone built a chalet among the oaks down a long boat lane. I see the steep shingle roof between trees where my grandparents live time without end. They watch me following the lane that leads towards them and away, under pale oak trees whose branches make a cage filled with lights and the old cries of doves, and where at night owls flutter like rags trapped above the tide line, calling me out of sleep. Wild child, making shadows leap the walls of the steep angled attic among salt sweet night smells, while out across soughing grass the sea murmurs loss, and I float from the open night window, a scrappy moth among the stars that see themselves reflected and afloat in infinite water. Each one a coracle, adrift in its own pool, but not like Moses. No, I'm no lost child between the giant yellow crests and irises cramming the waterways with gaudy, as my father walks ahead into the glare, a violet streak in the yellow afternoon, and vanishes, while water pools below a white railing always now and here, where the pillbox entrance gapes across the ditch, releasing its toad stink of piss and fear. Remember, round the next bend, you can see the monument, and I do, with the window wound right down and a wide open smell of France blowing in the car. My father, man of Kent, is following the lane he's known since he was a child on Romney before the war. And afternoon is always green and gold between the reeds where waders run like ghosts of birds, as deep beneath roots and silt, the boys who had to ditch say their own names, mouthing silently the ones he could not save on missions over the North Sea. But still the waves lie and lie, the sea always unsatisfied, breathing up dikes and across low fields. It condemns the shabby pubs and bungalows, while shadows pool along Boat Lane, where my own ghosts walk on water. Grandma in flowered housecoat, grandpa carrying his camera. Here they come down the lane where bulrushes taller than me thrum. Beetles with antler claws too heavy for them stumble at my feet. Once again, and for the first time, I'm following my father, who belongs to marsh water and to the sea. You've gone silent.
I've gone silent. I was saying magnificent. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I think we'll have time, and it would be nice for listeners to hear the poem for your.
Poem.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a title poem, so it's a longish poem, but it's a great poem, and it would be nice to perhaps we can finish off the formal part of our chat with this. And before you read it, just a question about landscape, because you mentioned Ted Hughes and in a sort of unsettling landscape. I mean, when one thinks of Frankenstein anyway, one thinks of, I mean, I don't know, I get chills, I think about.
Absolutely, yes.
and I think of the English countryside, or parts of it anyway, that one doesn't, I mean, I don't only think of primroses and things.
Exactly, yes.
So bogs and marshes are in your book.
Exactly.
But I also
where
think,
in England did you live?
I lived in London, in central London, near Baker Street, and
Oh, lucky you.
yeah, but
That's where I went to music college.
but we went on holiday to North Wales, I remember, a couple of times. And
yes. Well, that's pretty nice, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. But in the landscape, I don't know, maybe it's just my own obsessions, but one thinks of Virginia Woolf going down to the water and then disappearing. I mean, I wonder, is there I mean, every little line is a sort of touchstone to one's own, readings and memories. But anyway, it's a beautiful book. Let's hear the poem, shall we?
Yes, thanks, Indran. And I guess just to say about Virginia Woolf, yes. I mean, I guess particularly with marshes, I think they heighten for me that sense, that palimpsest sense again, that sense that the earth is kind of provisional, that the water table might rise up again. Never mind tidal waves, the water table might just rise up again, and indeed will with global warming. The sea levels will rise, but so will the water table, and reclaim. And so that in a sense, we are all, if you live on marshland, Louise Gluck has that wonderful book about relationships and dodgy family relationships, difficult familial relationships and sibling relationships, the house on marshland. And that sense of, not so much that you will, the image of tumbling into suddenly a ditch, but more that sense of creeping, some other force creeping up, like the unconscious, like kind of creeping up in your dreams and so on. Yeah, I think it's an incredibly telling kind of landscape.
And is the whole book sort of out of a dream? I mean, this whole come down in a sense. I mean,
Yeah. Well, isn't that one of the things? I mean, I'm quite resistant to that fashion there's been for certainly for British poets to say, oh, well, writing poems like kind of transcribing, you're kind of translating from what you've been given. And I think that's a bit pretentious, but I do think there's quite a lot to be said for, well, in all good writing really, isn't there, for paying attention to what the irrational part of your mind is the connection it's making, you know. I mean, it's, or at least the connection making part of your mind, you know, so that you have illusions and you have that layeredness. I mean, that's what I love when I'm reading, you know. So yeah. So I think, you know, I mean, Emily Dickinson, you know, obviously tell the whole truth, but tell it slant, success in circuit lies. And I do think that when you're writing a poem, for me, the experience of writing a poem is that I'm looking away from it, I'm looking over here, and the poem is sort of there. If I don't look at it, it might come. But if I look at it, I will it, and I force it, well, what do I really want to say? Well, then it evaporates.
And you use words like water and I mean, I'm somewhat hard to grasp water, right? But you're talking about very real, I mean, bodies and experiences. Maybe when you dredge, what will come up, you know?
Yes, absolutely.
So anyway.
The concreteness of water is very, I mean, it has lots of lives for us, doesn't it? You know, bodies of water, a little bit of water. It's that malleable. I do think the life of the senses is it's an aid to understanding, you know, existential stuff. I think certainly for me, I have intuitively clothe abstract ideas in, I ascribe material qualities to abstract ideas. I mean, something that Rilke massively did. I'm not comparing myself to Rilke in any way, obviously.
No.
You know, Rilke had this wonderful way of talking about, well, for example, in the Diary of Mary Lord, doesn't he? He talks about, he can conceptualize a concept. So he can give you the sense of a concept coming as a kind of almost like a spatial entity, even before he's said what the content of that concept is. I think that feels very intuitively familiar to that. I recognize that, you know, I feel comfortable with that. So.
And the book is widely available, right? I mean,
it is, absolutely, yes, and much more widely available because it's published by, it's wonderful news actually, because I've gone to Corsair, who are just starting a poetry list in Britain. Corsair, part of Hachette, part of Little Brown, so really widely available all over the world. And they're publishing my next prose book too, which is about the legacy of romantic thought about the countryside. So I have a wonderful editor there, Sarah Castleton. It's just fantastic. So this is a long poem.
Thank you.
Come Down. And it has an epigraph from Sidney Nolan. I wanted to know the true nature of the otherness I had been born into. Come down where it narrows, down over the last field where the valley squeezes almost shut, then opens. Come down into light and dark, systole and diastole, water moving shadows below beaches and steep fields. Come and find the place you thought you remembered, not hidden among trees, but standing at the valley corner, still the same, a tall, plain house, though you can't greet the strangers who crowd through it. They pass in and out, mouths moving silently as if underwater. You can't read their lips, but light turns on the upturned faces. Come down as everything breaks off mid-story, tractor tracks, a bucket at a gate, traces of the ones who left just this morning, centuries ago. And is it here in holy pantomime that suddenly a horse rears and rears, all soundless flash and buckle, and the dragon impaled on the saint's spear rears back from hooves, thundering in silence by its head, one struggle knotted in one stone, where the red stain spreads like something entering a wound to turn the blood that gallops in your ears? Or are those hooves beyond the river, almost out of sight among grey branches, tasseled gold with mistletoe? Is it rumour? Or does something watch you with terrified beast eyes? It doesn't matter. Sit down, take off your boots and wash your feet in this slow red river where plastic sacks float, slide, settle as some ancient muscle of sediment breaks surface like the backs of giant lizards that came down to drink, flexing their wings. Time was already calling them, and the small white clouds raced overhead, but you were neither here nor anywhere. The valley didn't know you yet, although you've always known the light lying along the top field and the pear tree's hieroglyph, because you stand just out of frame, watching as if from some shore where once upon a time and again you witness, say, a ship lift, perhaps, and come down as a har flagged with gulls slips up its mast, carrying old smells amid the ragged light and bird screams of memory before words. This is not desire, as out on the difficult water, a stranger sails away with you into the future where you and he never meet, not even in the unknown country, that long loneliness where he's taking you who don't speak his language. But this is what it means to witness. This too is belonging, catching cold, while the youth on board the distant ship dreams of a child who floats, her face pale, her hair spread and tangled, like the dream in which she hears blood surf roar far away beneath the world, and all night long digs in sand, believing she can reach Australia. Down and down she digs, and suddenly here is wide scrubland, red rock, the colour of home, and she is you, and you see, wavering like tears on the brim of sight, slowly appear 3 children walking an enormity alone together, where the bare sky meets the road. And this too is belonging. 3 lost children, taking the measure of their strangeness as the curious creatures move past like doxology, and time folds into another century where you come walking down with them into the future they won't arrive at. Stay with them in the plank house among roses where they do arrive at last, and give thanks in plain hymns in the old tongue as the evening river slides past shining. Come back to the creek you've never seen. Step down into light and darkness, water standing orange, pink, terracotta in the leads, wooden shacks, and a tin veranda where you walk up to the bar, remembering you were always here in the body's forethought, in its heft, heat, and juice, in the smile of a stranger who will never speak your name. Waiting with the mother tongue to become local, like sandstone softening as water threads below beaches and fields that don't change, or change absolutely, depending who comes down the slope among faint constellations of wild plum. Not ancestors, but first-comers stumbling down, who believed in the valley, knowing already its sly light between leaves, lichen and hanging damp, smells as old as another country. This too is belonging, where a blackbird calls between the trees so clearly now, or was it years ago when you were a child on a rope swing? Still, strange figures pass you, moving through the orchard, as a breeze stirs, breathing seems to fill the leaves. And look, the old ones keep passing through us, saying, world is wide, we must come down together into its valley.
Bravo, bravo. I would use the word historic, a wonderful reading. Thank you. It's so great to have it on the show.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And I think we can end there, but I can't resist mentioning that there is one more poem in the book at the very end that follows that, a kind of coda which takes you somewhere else, and it's really quite lovely because it's sort of an invitation for the sequel or for the next book,
Yes, I hope it is. Yes.
So we can keep it a surprise for listeners, or you can read it and we can close there as you. I'll leave it to you, but it's a great book. Thank you very much, Fiona. And
You're Indran.
Thank
you very much for having me on the show.
Sure. It's a lot of fun doing this poetry program, and let's meet again soon.
I look forward to it.
All right, and all right. So we'll leave it as a gift in waiting for the readers when they discover the book. I mean, the last poem. I mean, all the very best to you, and
thank you very much, Indran.
And we'll be in close touch. Thanks, Fiona. All the best. Cheers.
Thank you.
All right, I'll stop the recording now.